On behalf of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, I would like to thank you for tuning in to this panel discussion, Civically Engaged Wisconsin Women, Past, Present, and Future. My name is Julie Bunchek, and I'm a program manager with WIPS. The Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service is a unit of the UW system and was founded in 2007 in Wausau. WIPS enhances the civic life of communities in Wisconsin by developing future leaders, educating and engaging citizens, and addressing community needs. We work with citizens and communities to address local, state, and national public policy issues that matter. We do this by organizing and facilitating conferences and workshops, panels and lectures, candidate forums, public dialogue events, original research projects, and student service opportunities. Following tonight's panelist presentations, there will be time for questions. As we are using Zoom webinar, attendees are not able to turn on their cameras or microphones. But please submit your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Our moderator will see them there. And I should say you can use the Q&A or the chat feature, and we'll make sure that we see them. If after our program tonight, you are inspired, moved, pleased, or otherwise enjoyed the events, we encourage you to make a donation to WIPS. We are a self-supporting organization and depend on the generosity of our supporters to survive and thrive. Your support will help secure the continuation of WIPS as an organization, as well as ensure future programs. You may make a contribution by visiting our website, wipps.org, and clicking on Donate. And I'll be sure to share that website in the chat function. We are so pleased this evening for the support of PBS Wisconsin for this event. Our moderator this evening is Marissa Wojcik. Marissa is a multimedia journalist and producer on the Here and Now news team. She produces field reports on issues impacting people across the state, interviews guests on the weekly live web show Noon Wednesday, and creates content that explains the deeper context behind current issues. Marissa, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone and welcome for joining us. We have a full roster for you all this evening, and we're going to begin with a message from U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin, who co-sponsored the resolution creating the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. And if you hold on one moment, we will load that video.
For hosting today's panel. Good evening, I'm Senator Tammy Baldwin, and I want to thank the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service for hosting today's panel, and for all you do to educate, engage, and energize Wisconsinites on issues that are important to our communities. We're joined together tonight to highlight and recognize the great strides that women have made in Wisconsin and throughout the nation in promoting equality and civic engagement. 100 years ago, after decades and decades of struggle by brave women and men, our nation finally extended to women the most fundamental right of our democracy, the right to vote. The struggle for women's suffrage was fought in every corner of our country, particularly in Wisconsin, where we were the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. This struggle was fought by women of all backgrounds, including women of color who fought and marched alongside their white colleagues in the suffrage movement, but whose contributions went largely unsung, and many of whom were still denied the right to vote after the 19th Amendment was ratified. Just as the fight for voting rights went on then, our fight continues today. We cannot mistake progress for victory. With just 127 women currently serving in Congress, we are well short of equal representation in government. Government works best when legislatures reflect the people we work for, when they look like America, and that's why it's important to increase the number of women and women of color who serve in public office. Women are half the population. We should be half our nation's government, too. As women, we bring our life experience to the job. It helps inform our debates, our votes, the policies that we deliver. And you know what? Women get stuff done. I have worked with women on both sides of the aisle to deliver solutions to the challenges that are facing the American people. And as we see more women in public office, we will see more of these bipartisan solutions. So today, let's celebrate the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote and recommit to the work of making our government look more like the people it aims to represent and get more women in elective office. Thank you, and have a great night.
And we want to thank U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin for her remarks. Next, we're going to hear from Wisconsin First Lady Cathy Evers, who over the past year chaired the Wisconsin 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration Committee, created through executive order by Governor Tony Evers. The committee organized events to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, the fact that Wisconsin was the first state to ratify, and celebrated women who continue to inspire others to work for parity and inclusion for all women. And over to you, First Lady Cathy Evers.
Good evening. I am pleased to participate in this wonderful event, and I'd like to thank PBS Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service for creating this forum to explore the past, present, and future of women's civic engagement in Wisconsin. Since April last year, I've had the pleasure of chairing a great committee celebrating the 100th anniversary of the enactment of the 19th Amendment. On this committee, I had a chance to work with a terrific group of women to celebrate Wisconsin's role in pushing the women's suffrage movement forward, including three of the evening's exceptional panelists. As most of you know, Wisconsin women have a long history of working towards women's suffrage before the passage of the 19th Amendment. And Wisconsin was the first state to ratify the amendment back in June of 1919. And while the 19th Amendment was a very important milestone, it did not guarantee all women the right to vote. In fact, many people of color did not gain the right to vote for more than 40 years later, until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As we commemorate 100 years of women's suffrage, let's all acknowledge we are celebrating 100 years of continued activism to protect and expand voting rights, continued activism to increase women in leadership positions, and continued activism to increase equality for women and people of color. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this event. I look forward to the discussion, to hearing from our panelists, three friends and colleagues who are civically engaged Wisconsin women. Thank you.
Thank you, First Lady Evers. As we are looking back on the storied history of the women's right to vote, we hear from another voice from Wisconsin's federal delegation. PBS Wisconsin spoke with U.S. Representative Gwen Moore of Milwaukee as part of a special program called Wisconsin Women Vote. Here is some of what she shared.
I am so proud that Wisconsin was the first state to ratify the women's right to vote. No, we're not in a place of equity. What's even more difficult to reconcile than the fact that it was in the 1960s before there was a general enfranchise of all people is the fact that in 2020, Black people, low-income people are still fighting for the right to vote. But I do think we're in a place where we have really energized and activated Black women. I think both parties, actually, in our country, both major parties have recognized that Black women are the most reliable voters that there are, that they're the base, and that, if you can curry the interest of Black women, you have a solid, committed group of people. You know what they always say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so often women's rights are on the menu. And I think it's because we have, 17, 18% representation in Congress, in legislative bodies. Oh, that's awesome. When are we rolling this out? It is just, it's wonderful to see all these women coming to the table, the veritable hidden figures coming forward, standing their ground and running for office. We need you, young women. We need you to be at the table.
Our panelists tonight come from all different backgrounds and areas of expertise and have come to share their historical knowledge as well as personal experience. On our panel this evening is Shannon Holsey. She's the president of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians, Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, and Simone Munson from the Wisconsin Historical Society. They will first each bring us through some key moments in the history of Wisconsin's struggle towards suffrage, followed by a discussion amongst our panelists, and then we will open it up to your questions. So first up on our historical tour is Simone Munson, Collection Development Coordinator for the Wisconsin Historical Society, where she supervises the acquisition of collections for the library and archives. She earned a master's degree in history from the University of New Mexico and a master's in library and information sciences from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She currently resides in Black Earth with her family. And welcome, Simone.
Hi, thank you so much for having me tonight. So I'm going to share my screen because part of what I have been asked to speak about this evening is to try and give a very succinct overview of the women's suffrage movement and what this struggle actually looked like for the women who were participating in the suffrage movement and were sort of the boots on the ground, and how does that connect with civic engagement. And so when we think about the history of the women's suffrage movement, and that connection to civic engagement, as I was sort of thinking through this 70-year time period, I sort of, came to realize that a lot of the elements that we think of in modern civic engagement really found their first real successes in the 19th century. The abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement are the two biggest movements of the 19th century that are advocating for social change. And these movements go through lots of swings and have their ups and downs, but they all use these early elements of civic engagement to try and make their argument for the change that they want to see happen in the United States. So I'm going to very quickly run through sort of 5 areas that could be considered strategies, elements of civic engagement that we see in our society today that were employed by suffragists through from the 1840s all the way up to 1920 to get the passage of what we now call the 19th Amendment. And so what I'm going to talk about very briefly is how they got organized and spread the word. This term intersectionality, which is, a more recent term and wouldn't have been used in the 19th century, but we can sort of see that intersectionality, the testing of legal precedent and pushing boundaries to expand rights, the idea of peaceful protest, and then what ends up being the most successful thing is the idea of issue relevancy, and what I like to think of as the importance of a good PR manager. So oftentimes I'm asked, when did the suffrage movement start? How did the whole thing begin? And I like to say that as long as there have been women, there have been women fighting for women's rights. But in terms of the United States, since the founding of our country, there have been women who have been advocating for women's rights. And even as John Adams and the other writers and signers of the Declaration and the Constitution were trying to think of what this country would look like, the women of our country were also advocating for rights. And very famously, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband in March of 1776, and she said, "I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion." And in some ways, the story of the women's suffrage movement is the story of that rebellion that Abigail so accurately predicted. And so when we start with the thinking about the formal suffrage movement and how things really get rolling, a lot of people attribute the beginning of it to the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention took place in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, and it was a 2-day convention where women gathered together to talk about women's issues, to think about what do women want? How do they want to be represented in politics? And the women who created this convention were very smart. The first day of the convention, they only allowed women to attend, but the second day of the convention, they allowed more people, men to come and visit. And this is where we start to see that first intersection with the abolitionist movement, because the Seneca Falls Convention was also an abolitionist convention. And Frederick Douglass spoke on the second day, and a lot of the well-known abolitionist men were there to participate in the conversation. And really this connection between the abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement continued for quite some time until after the Civil War. And that these two movements worked really close together, and they found that it was mutually beneficial for the movements to be aligned. Things did change. The passage of the 15th Amendment did drive a wedge between the abolitionist movement, or at that point, the African American civil rights movement, and the women's suffrage movement. The passage of the 15th Amendment, which guarantees African American men the right to vote, initially there was a lot of advocacy for that amendment to include women. And very notably, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony did not support the passage of the 15th Amendment unless it included women in that passage. And this is really a very important division that happens between these two movements, because it's at this point that afterwards we really do see sharp segregation between the white women's suffrage movement and the African American women's suffrage movement, where the two groups are very divided or kept separate. And part of the reason for this is because the Southern women, as they were sort of advocating for these changes, would not include African American women in their version of suffrage. And so women across the country had to decide, white women across the country had to decide, were they going to keep the Southern women happy, or were they going to advocate for more inclusion? Now that's a very cut and dry, easy way of explaining it, and it's more nuanced than that. There were obviously Northern women who did not want African Americans included in the suffrage bill as well, but this is sort of how we see the movement divided. Another place where we have some intersectionality is a little later in the movement, when the suffrage movement aligns with the temperance movement. In the 1880s, we see Frances Willard, who is the president of the Women Christian Temperance Union. She advocates for the idea of suffrage as a way of successfully gaining support for the temperance movement. And from the 1880s up until the passage of the Volstead Act, we do see that the suffrage movement and the temperance movement kind of support each other. Unfortunately, in Wisconsin, this was not a very popular intersection, and as temperance was a very unpopular idea in Wisconsin, Wisconsin suffragists did not always see the benefit of putting those things together. So how did the women of the United States get organized and spread the word? In much the same way that we do today, using the technology that was available to them. They organized and they formed women's clubs, and the women's club movement is a very important movement in the second half of the 19th century. These local clubs would have supported not just suffrage, but also just women's civic engagement in general. They went by many different names. Some had suffrage in the title, others were more about self-improvement, welfare, and civic engagement, and suffrage was just one of the issues that they concerned themselves with. In Wisconsin, two prominent leaders in the women's club movement were Mrs. Carrie Horton, who was the president of the Women's Improvement Club, which was the African American Women's Club in Milwaukee, and Theodora Winton Yeomans, who was a very active suffragist and president of the Women's Club movement here in Wisconsin. And they also used the press to sort of get their message out. And the message was, my dogs are barking in the background. Hold on one second. And that message was telling women why they thought the vote was important. They had to convince both men and women that the vote was important to them, and the press was an important element in that. So the third way that women became civically engaged and tested the boundaries of things was to use legal precedent and these expanding rights to their benefit. And this was done in a couple of different ways, but the most successful way was what we call the partial suffrage movement, or the state-by-state movement. And this was where local women would advocate and petition their state legislatures for the right to vote in local and municipal elections. And the idea was that after they got the right to vote in local and municipal elections, and after enough states granted women this right, that eventually they would be able to petition for a federal amendment. And in some ways, this strategy was very successful. I really like the map that's on this slide, because it's really sort of an interesting way to represent the geography of the state and the United States and the movement. Unlike a lot of movements that we think of in the United States, the women's suffrage movement actually moved from west to east. So it was more difficult to convince men and women on the East Coast that women's suffrage was an important issue. And in the West, they were more easily swayed. Part of this had to do with the way that the West was settled. Wyoming is the first state to grant women full suffrage. And they write it into their state constitution. And so we see some other states follow that trend. And part of the idea behind that was that they were trying to encourage women to come to that state as the states were opening up for white settlement. So that was part of the strategy. And you can see here that, the Midwest has granted some partial suffrage, but not complete suffrage. So in Wisconsin, women were able to vote in issues of related to schools. And the woman who's pictured on this slide is Reverend Olympia Brown, and she offered a very important legal test to this suffrage rule. Women were allowed to vote in school matters, and this was passed by the legislature in around 1885. And Olympia Brown decided that if she was allowed to vote in school matters, it didn't just mean that she could vote for school board. It also meant that she could vote for county executive, because the county executive also plays an important role in schools. And she could vote for mayor, because the mayor also played an important role in schools. And she could also vote for treasurer, because treasurers fund the schools. So she tried to push the boundaries of what she could vote for and how this law was interpreted. Unfortunately, her legal battle wasn't successful. And it's not until because of some back and forth and some bureaucratic sort of things surrounding this law, the women in Wisconsin don't really get it all settled until around 1900. In 1912, Wisconsin has a full statewide referendum to try and see if women will be allowed to vote statewide in state elections. And this is a very, very important referendum for the state. And it has a lot of the sort of grassroots elements involved in that kind of organizing. There's women who are speaking, and they're going to county fairs, and they're trying to encourage men to vote in favor of this referendum in 1912. And it's a very big movement. The press is sort of dominated with this issue of women's suffrage. Unfortunately, the men of Wisconsin don't vote in favor of the statewide referendum, partially because of how closely the women's suffrage is linked to the temperance movement. And so Wisconsin women need to wait until a federal amendment is passed before they will ultimately get the right to vote in all elections. Another element of civic engagement that we see women participating in is peaceful protest. This part of the movement is most popular in the 19-teens. And we see very, very large marches and rallies that take place in large cities like Washington, D.C. and Chicago. In March of 1913 in Washington, D.C., the day before President Wilson's inauguration, there's one of the largest marches in the history of Washington, D.C., a very large suffrage march. President Wilson ran on an anti-suffrage platform, and the women of our country wanted to make sure that the president knew that they were there and that they were going to be heard. In 1916, the Republican National Convention in Chicago, there was a large women march in the rain outside the National Convention, and many, many women from Wisconsin attended that march. If you've ever seen pictures of Wisconsin suffragists wearing yellow tunics, this is the march where they wore those yellow tunics. And then as pictured here in the slide, we also have the Silent Sentinels, who were organized by Alice Paul and stood outside the White House for more than 18 months. There were more than 1,000 women who volunteered and participated in these protests outside the White House, making sure that President Wilson sort of knew that they were there and that this was an issue that was important. So all of these pieces together, they take place over a 70-year period. And it's really this idea of what are the strategies that keep this issue in the forefront? How are people engaging with politics? How are women able to use the voices and the tools that they have to be successful? And it's there's definitely a relevancy issue, and how can you make an argument for women's inclusion in politics? This is a struggle, right? It takes a very long time. And one of the final pieces that fell into place in convincing the men of our country to allow women the right to vote is World War I. So the war takes place, and much like during World War II, when the United States enters the war, the women of our country are asked to step up and participate in society in different ways, right? They're entering the workforce, they're taking on new roles on the farm, whether they were expanding or different, because they're responsible for food, the food chain, they're responsible for industry when the men go overseas to fight during World War I. And it's this element, this involvement in politics and industry and business, that is really one of the elements that convinces the government that women should be allowed to vote. And in 1919, President Wilson is convinced that the only way to win the war is to allow women the right to vote because of the role that they play in society and how important they are to the war effort. And part of this strategy was actually designed by a Wisconsin woman. Carrie Chapman Catt was one of the national leaders who was responsible for making this strong connection between women helping to win the war and a woman's involvement and necessity to have the right to vote. So President Wilson sends the amendment to the legislature. The legislature approves the amendment in June of 1919, and then it has to go to the states for 2/3 states to ratify. And as we already heard in our introduction, Wisconsin is the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment, with Illinois and Michigan coming in as a close second and third. And that's something that Wisconsin has to be very proud of, and it really is just the jumping off point, right, for how women continue to be civically engaged, and what happens next. I always like to think of like the 1920 election, and after women went out to vote, and it's done, and we have the right to vote. What were they going to do with all this time and energy that they had? And it doesn't take long, and a lot of the suffragists figure out that there needs to be an advocacy group, and they're very instrumental in founding the League of Women Voters. They're instrumental in the early passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. But as has been mentioned, the suffrage amendment did not guarantee suffrage for everyone. And so there's still large groups of the population who are left out of the suffrage of voting. And so for many people, it's not until 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act or the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that these doors are further opened. And then suffrage becomes an issue again with the passage of the 26th Amendment, which changes the voting age from 21 to 18. And then, the legacy and how we use our vote today, how we sort of think about being civically engaged, what are the next steps? And, Tammy Baldwin in her introduction to our group tonight said, we won't really be there until women are equally represented in government. These are statistics from the Center for American Women in Politics. And as of September 2019, this is where women's representation in elected office stands. 51% of the population, but only 25% of the Senate, 23% of the House, 29% of statewide elected executives, 29% of statewide legislative seats, 22% of mayors in cities with populations over 30,000, and there has never been a woman as president. So there still is quite a ways to go. So that is my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and just hoping that overview will help place some of our things in context for the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Simone. Next, we hear from Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, who has been a member of the Wisconsin Supreme Court for 25 years. Justice Bradley serves on several boards and committees, but two seem particularly relevant for tonight's program. She is the chair of the Board of Managerial Trustees of the International Association of Women Judges, which has members over 6,000 women judges worldwide. Its mission is to promote gender equality and enhance human rights. She is also a founding member of the Global Network on Electoral Justice, which brings together international specialists to discuss electoral challenges and contemporary democracies. Added to those credentials is the fact that Justice Bradley is a native of Richland Center, a small town in southwest Wisconsin considered an epicenter of the Wisconsin women's suffrage movement. Justice Bradley, thank you for being here.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And thanks to Simone. What a challenge to give in a few minutes 70 years of history. So I'm going to begin my comments with one of my favorite quotes, and it's this: "I long to sing out about the intense inspiration I feel when I hear of the lives of strong women." And tonight we are talking about a movement of strong women and strong men that we celebrate, and people who worked so hard to bring the right to vote to women. The next few minutes, I'm going to be a storyteller. I don't get to be a storyteller very often, so I'm going to be a storyteller, and I'm going to share with you some of the stories of Wisconsin history that deal with the women's movement, the women's suffrage movement, and how it affects my personal experience. I am a member of the legal profession. As a former lawyer and a judge and now a justice, that didn't just happen. It came about because of a young woman. I'm going to tell her story. Her name was Lavinia Goodale. She was a lawyer from Janesville, Wisconsin. And this young woman had the audacity to think that she could be admitted to the bar of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I'm going to tell another story, and it's a story I love. and it has several components, but a story of Ada James and her family from my hometown in Richland Center. And they really became essential to the women's suffrage movement in Wisconsin. So let me set the stage, the background for you. And I think I'll just touch upon also what Simone was talking about. So turn back with me, if you will, to the year of 1848. It was a good year, I guess, for Wisconsin. We became a state. And it was a good year for women. 1848 was Seneca Falls. And it was the first ever gathering of women and a few supportive men that came up with a declaration of sentiments. And although the Declaration of Independence and our United States Constitution had not yet recognized women's rights, these few brave souls gathered together at Seneca Falls to embark upon a struggle for equality under the law. Now I'm going to pause for a moment to introduce you to a young woman from Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. Her name was Louise J. Smith. And she, at age 12, attended the Seneca Falls Convention. She was there with famous names like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who organized it. Frederick Douglass's name was mentioned. He was there. And there she was, this little 12-year-old girl from Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. 72 years later, she was only one of two people that are known that attended the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And at age 84, she voted. She voted in the November 2nd, 1920 presidential election. And two women were able to see the fruits of their labors come to reality. It was almost 20 years after that, after the Seneca Falls Convention, when Wisconsin had their first women's suffrage convention, and it was in Janesville in 1867. And a great number of women and some men attended, and they were buoyed by letters that were sent to them to be read at the conference or the convention by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and also, I think, Lucy Stone. And Janesville really was one of the initial areas for women's suffrage focus. And it's in the city of Janesville that I begin my story of Lavinia Goodell, because there she was, a young woman in Janesville, Wisconsin, and she brought a case before the Wisconsin Supreme Court in 1875. The case is called In Re the Admission of Lavinia Goodell. She came to Wisconsin at I think age 31. She came from New York. She was a very successful woman there. She was a newspaper editor. She was an editor at Harper's Bazaar, and she came to Wisconsin to take care of her elderly parents. And when she moved to Janesville in, I think, 1871, she started studying the law. You didn't go to law school, you studied the law. And she studied the law for 3 years and was found competent to practice in the county court in Rock County in Janesville. And under the custom at the time, even though a lawyer had been admitted to a county court, they still had to apply for admission to the bar if they wanted to appear before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And ordinarily that was no, as I say with legalese, no big deal. But of course, this was no ordinary situation because this applicant for admission was a woman. Her motion was heard in December of 1875. At that time, there were only 3 members that constituted the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Edward Ryan gave the opinion of the court. And he didn't hold his hand like this, but it was a thumbs down opinion. But it was more than just a thumbs down. I mean, he said things in this opinion like, and I'm just going to quote a sentence or two, "It would be revolting to all female sense of innocence and sanctity of their sex, that women should be permitted professionally to mix in all the nastiness of the world which finds its ways into courts of justice. He went on to talk about how it would be an affront to the sensibility of their ears. And then he concluded, if, as counsel says, these things are to come, we will take no voluntary part in bringing them about. Your motion for admission is denied. But Lavinia didn't take no for an answer. She went back to Janesville. She talked to her state senator, who was also her friend. They lobbied the legislature. Legislature passed a bill that said that there had to be gender equality in the admission to practice law in the bar before the Supreme Court. So she went back to the Supreme Court. Another case, and lo and behold, she was admitted. There was, however, one of the three who was a lone dissenter, and that was Chief Justice Edward Ryan. But organize they did after that. People, men and women in Wisconsin, were continuing with their efforts in the suffrage movement. And lo and behold, you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony coming to our state. It is amazing to me how many times those two women came to communities large and small around Wisconsin. I've been on the Supreme Court for 25 years. I've spoken at a number of places around the state. And there was a period of time when I would start a speech with saying whether or not Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony came to the community. And indeed, it was one of those trips. Susan B. Anthony came to my hometown of Richland Center. So that allows me to turn the page to my next favorite story. And that is a story of Ada James and the James family of Richland Center and the part they played in the women's suffrage movement. A series of articles in the Milwaukee Journal newspaper in December of 1924 sets the stage, and it describes the role that Richland Center played in the suffrage movement. And the first article, first paragraph began this way. Away down in the southwestern corner of Wisconsin, the little town of Richland Center has been glorified above all towns in the state in that it is the cradle of women's suffrage in Wisconsin. The article continues, on an afternoon in June of 1882, a little band of women met at the home of one of their members, and that was Ada James's mother, Laura Briggs James, and Laura, as husband, was a future state senator. And the article says they gathered together to discuss cautiously and behind drawn blinds the new and fearfully radical subject, women's suffrage. You know, I almost can, when I read that, I read this article several times, I can almost hear the drum roll after that. Because when I was growing up in Richland Center, you know, to me, I thought the sleepy town of Richland Center, little did I realize that it had been a hotbed of radicals, women audacious enough to think that they could vote. Now, the women's club that was formed on that day in 1882 was really a suffrage club. But because the founders were wives of prominent local officials and businessmen, professionals, they chose to keep the word suffrage out of the name. And their ruse was quite effective because the Richland Center Democrat newspaper would report on their regular meetings. And they reported one of the meetings was, quote, dedicated to discussing the life of William of Normandy. And another one was, the subject of the meeting was, quote, home duties. But all the while, these women were planning and plotting for suffrage. Ada was 10 years old when Susan B. Anthony was their house guest in the fall of 18 1886. And Anthony came to Richland Center. She spoke upstairs in what was called the Bailey's Opera House, right on Court Street in downtown Richland Center. And Ada was destined to play a leading role in securing the ratification of the 19th Amendment. In 1910, she organized one of the major suffrage organizations in Wisconsin. It's called the Political Equality League. And they were a counter to the more conservative and older organization. 1911, she enlisted the support of her dad, who at that time was a state senator. And he, together with other women clubs throughout the state, and Theodore Yeoman, successfully lobbied the legislature to authorize a 1912 state referendum. And Simone talked about that. And so Ada and her colleagues were going around the state. They gave a full state press, barnstorming the state. All sorts of antics they employed to get attention and to make speeches about women's suffrage movement. One of the newspapers reported that they were traveling around the state in an automobile. They were described by some opponents as disgraceful to womanhood, if not immoral, that a woman was driving the vehicle. So to save their reputations, Ada hired an elderly male chauffeur. And there are pictures you can see. The State Historical Society has them of these women in this car going around the state with the elderly male chauffeur. But when the referendum in 1912 was held, Wisconsin men voted down women's suffrage, 63 to 37%. And it was just one of the many, many defeats that women endured, and men who were also involved in the suffrage movement, many, many defeats along the way. Mention was made, of course, by a couple of folks so far about Wisconsin being the first to ratify, the first state to officially ratify the 19th Amendment, granting women suffrage on June 10th. So here's the rest of the story. And of course, it deals with Richland Center. So after the House of Representatives had passed the 19th Amendment legislation, it came to the floor of the Senate. And in the gallery that day of the Senate was Wisconsin's own Belle Case La Follette. And when the Senate passed the amendment legislation, Belle then telegraphed the Wisconsin delegation in Wisconsin, urging them to be the first state to ratify the amendment. So the race was on. And Ada, again, took one of the lead roles, and with her father's help, they made this happen. And they worked night and day for ratification. And finally, the Wisconsin legislature passed resolution of the ratification about 11 o'clock on the morning of June 10th, 1919. And when the votes were being counted, they were informed that Illinois had already passed it, just passed it short minutes or an hour beforehand. So now what to do? Well, Ada persuaded her dad. Ada and her dad had come from Richland Center on the train that morning, and they were, he was intending to go back at the end of the day. But Ada persuaded her dad that he should be a personal messenger carrying the resolution of the Wisconsin legislature to the Secretary of State's office in Washington, D.C., so that Wisconsin can be the first to ratify. Well, he wasn't prepared for this. She emptied her satchel. Friends gave him some necessary provisions and some money. They went to talk with the governor. The ink was, they say, still wet on the bill when he boarded a train to Washington, and he reported to the proper bureau at the Secretary of State's office on June 13, right ahead of the envoy from Illinois. In fact, a newspaper article reported that as he was leaving, the Illinois gentleman was approaching the office. So these abbreviated stories that I tell are stories that touch upon my own personal experience as a woman in the legal profession and someone who hails from that small town in southwest Wisconsin called Richland Center. I'm going to close with a few words from Carrie Catt, and Simone mentioned Carrie Catt, because these two stories I tell you are so brief in the really detail that would show the struggle that the women's movement for suffrage endured. And of course, Carrie Catt was Susan B. Anthony's successor, and Carrie Catt was born in Ripon, Wisconsin. But this is what Carrie Catt said. "The vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars and the lives of thousands of women. Women have suffered agony of soul, which you never can comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. The vote is power," and she also goes on to say, "the vote is prayer, and use it." And I encourage everyone to use their vote in November. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Ann Walsh Bradley. You say you don't often get to be a storyteller, but that was a great story. Very, very exciting. Moving forward in the timeline, we now hear from Shannon Holsey, president of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians. Holsey has served 3 terms and is one of the youngest to ever lead the Stockbridge-Munsee. She also serves as president of the Great Lakes Intertribal Council. Holsey grew up on the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation in Bowler, Wisconsin, and has committed the tribe to serving as good stewards of its economic, environmental, cultural, and intellectual resources. Holsey's personal philosophy on leadership recognizes that Native Americans are growing economies, preparing students to succeed, delivering high-quality healthcare, protecting the environment, upholding tribal sovereignty, and solving the unique challenges facing tribal communities. And President Holsey, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Marissa, and thank you, First Lady Evers and Justice Bradley and Simone. It's a pleasure to be here. I think as we recognize the centennial passage of the 19th Amendment here in Wisconsin, or just in the United States, giving the women the right to vote, I want to demonstrate that women's strength and the power is not relegated to distant history. Much has been said this evening about the inspiration through the ages, but I also want to touch on the significance and impact of Native Americans. Much has been said about the inspiration of the ancient Iroquois or the Great League of Peace in planting the seeds that led to the formation of the United States of America and its representative democracy. The 1992 election was called the Year of the Women because the number of female senators tripled from 2 all the way to 6, and 24 women were elected to their first terms in the House, the largest number in congressional history. But by contrast, this year's election is being driven by increasingly overwhelming determination of a significant number of women from every demographic to vote at every level of the ballot, regardless of the gender of the candidate. Just to put things in context, the people of the Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Six Nations, who are from the East Coast, where my tribal nation originated from, they created the Native American model of governance far before the European settlers. And what it was fashioned around is the need of the 7 generations to come, and it was taken from their confederacy. So the principle dictated that the decisions that were made today would lead to sustainability for the next 7 generations into the future. This election, we are expecting millions of women to turn out the vote. Our future is absolutely female. Regardless of how we cast our ballots, every one of us owes thanks for that right, not only to early suffragettes like those from the East Coast of Gage, Caddy, Staten, and Mont, but to the Native Iroquois and our Ojibwe women right here in Wisconsin, who inspired them and the thousands a part of the suffrage movement. Native American matriarchal tribes believed women's liberation was possible because they knew this government design provided the modern world's first conception of inherent rights, natural equality of condition, and the establishment of civilized governments upon this basis. Ultimately, this growing awareness of Iroquois women's status provided us proof that for the early American suffragettes, that in contrast to what they had been taught, women's disenfranchisement was neither natural or inevitable, and it influenced their worldview in ways that went far beyond the vote. As we reflect on this suffrage movement, we're grateful for this, and let us pause to consider the deep history of American women's political power. If we do, we will see not only the integral Native American culture has been a part of our political history, but that for women, our very right to vote is intrinsically linked to the civilization that secured the dignity of all people. And Iroquois women and Native women or Native civilizations provided that blueprint for how the world could be, which the US Constitution was fashioned after. Simone talked about 1965 and the Voting Rights Act and protections, after centuries of struggle, especially by Black women and men against poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory voting laws. It wasn't until 1984 that Mississippi became the last U.S. state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and it was March 22nd, 1984, becoming the last U.S. state to do so. But let's just quickly go back to 1924. That was the year that Native Americans were finally recognized as citizens. That was 4 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified, and it was the passage of the Snyder Act, or otherwise known as the Indian Citizenship Act, which Native Americans and U.S. citizens became U.S. citizens for the first time. But quite honestly, many Native American women and men are still, and people of color are effectively barred from voting for the next 4 decades until Utah became the last state to extend fully voting rights to Native Americans in 1962. It was sort of a lot of non-Native politicians or non-people of color and leaders in the federal government that really never envisioned that civilization policies would inspire Native people or even people of color, especially Native women, to rise and claim equal access to rights, citizenship, and voting. The women of the Bad River tribe in Wisconsin that same year were declared citizens of the United States, also established the first Indian League of Wisconsin voters in October of that year, because it was their thought that Indigenous people have a political voice in their nations long before white settlers arrived. And for Indigenous women, however, women's rights and voting rights were tools that were used for survival in defending against disposition of land and resources. For Native women, women's rights have never been separate from Native women's rights have never been separate from Native rights. Thus the case of Seal Rubidoux. Seal was one of those inspiring ladies who were part of the Odena, Bad Rivers, Native American Indian League Women of Voters. And she was young and robust. And so she was, through the Civil Rights Act of 1965, she was very instrumental in helping effectuate necessary change for voter suppression and all of those other issues, especially something significant like the Ballot Interference Prevention Act in Montana. So nearly 100 years later, and her remarkable past and the other 79 ladies of Bad River, her life stands as an allegory for Native American women's ongoing battle, and or even people of color, for advocacy for things like family, land, resources, and physical survival. She believes specifically that Native people deserve better, and that we too were entitled to benefits of the democratic process. And she was fiercely involved in politics and voting rights, and she participated as a member of several different democratic women's groups. So I'm sure there were many Native people and many women of color, and just women in general, like Seal Rubidoux, who advocated for women and women's voting rights, and whose history we may never know. But tonight I want to pay homage and show my gratification and respect of all the work that was done on the shoulders of our female ancestors. But on the centennial of that passage, let us also praise the obscure warrior women, especially Native women like Seal, who demanded justice and equity for not only their people, but for all people. And although we often were overlooked, and she and a small group of thoughtful women stood on the brave behinds and those beliefs, and were trailblazers, much like the women that were discussed by Justice Bradley and Simone this evening. And for those who turn up their noses at the words feminist or feminism or scoff at feminism as like a dirty or utterly pointless word, I just want to remind you of some fun facts, if you would, or just maybe disturbing facts about women, what women couldn't do in 1971. Yes, 1971. So in 1971, women could not get a credit card in her own name without the permission or signature of her husband. She could not be guaranteed that they would not be unceremoniously fired for the offense of getting pregnant. And that changed with the Pregnancy Demonstration Act of 1978. 1978, women could not serve on a jury. It was varied by state, but it wasn't until 1973 that women could serve on juries in all 50 states. Women could not fight on front lines, admitted into military academies until 1976. And it was not until 2013 that the military ban on women in combat was lifted. And prior to 1973, women were not allowed in the military as nurses or support staff. They could not get into receive an Ivy League education. And Yale and Princeton did not accept female students until 1969, and Harvard did not admit women until 1977. But there were other Ivy Leagues like Columbia and Brown and others that did not actually, some of them did not respectively admit until some into the early 70s and one into 1981. Women could not also take legal action against workplace sexual harassment. Indeed, for the first time, a court recognized office sexual harassment as grounds for any legal action, and that wasn't until 1977. Women did not have the right to decide not to have sex with their husbands until they wanted to, if the husband wanted to, and there was not the inclination of spousal rape or criminalization of it in all 50 states until 1993. And they could also not obtain health insurance at the same monetary rate as a man. So sex discrimination was not outlawed in health insurance until 2010. And not many, including sitting elected officials at the federal level, feel women did not mind paying more a little. Again, that date was 2010. And finally, the birth control pill. And that wasn't until after 1971. But it was more about the issue of reproductive freedom and women's rights to decide how and when they had children, or even career-oriented women who decided they wanted to complete their educations or enter the workforce, or actually, like the women on this panel, they did it all. But long before the women's suffrage movement in the United States, Native women, quite honestly, enjoyed, especially in matriarchal societies, equality of power in their respective communities. And again, that strength was not relegated. The power of women like the legendary Seal and Ada is instrumental and incredible. I have seen this since I was a little girl, even though I didn't quite know it. Our mothers instill it since they birth us. I never realized that my mother was constantly preparing me for a world outside my bubble. Life is tough. But even more so if you're a minority woman or just a woman in general, for the platform of equality and inclusion. And finally, our contribution to women's equality is going to be told. So it's seen between the engagement between women of all diverse groups. And it was the impetus for the suffragette movement in the United States. And to be able to see, our oppressed condition isn't universal. that it's not the way for every single woman. And once you see that and you know it, you understand it's possible to change that society. And some of them segregated. They would not, for example, let African American women join. Some of them work for the vote for white women only, and some of them work for voter suppression laws. While the suffrage movement drew influence from Native or Iroquois cultures or other diverse cultures, suffragettes largely brought the vote only to white women at some point, but it essentially became more equitable throughout time. And although we recognize the accomplishments of the suffragette movement and recognize the bravery of those who protested, held hunger strikes in jails, and were force-fed while they fought for those rights to have a voice in politics, it's also high time for us to forge a path and continuation of path forward to continue that effort of this movement. Women are the most consistent, reliable voting bloc across the country. Across the elections, year in and year out, representation matters. Seeing yourself there matters. Feminism is not just for other women, so know her story. Women's strength and power is not relegated to distant history. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon Holsey. And thank you to each of our panelists for providing such a rich contextual history and bringing us into today. And so now, leading into the next generation and preparing to make their mark on history, 83% of young people said in a Tufts University poll that they believe they have the power to change the country. And one of the ways they plan to do that is through the ballot box. So very briefly, we are going to hear from the younger generation.
I hear a lot of people telling me like, oh, I'm not going to vote. I don't want to vote. It's pointless. It don't matter. And it's just like, it do matter. Like, we're trying to see change.
Because otherwise people in office, whether you think it affects you or not, are going to be able to control your life in so many different ways.
Every single thing in place, like this all affects you in your life. Although you may not see it firsthand, in the long run you will. But I think 2020 has been a real like eye-opener and mind-opener for a lot of people. Putting the urgency that young people and people of color and other marginalized communities have seen for years, that's putting that in the light for everyone to see.
I would say if you have access to the resources and you have the ability to speak out and use your voice, then you should use it.
This year, it's definitely a make or break year. Like, we need everybody and anybody to vote.
Your voice matters, and we all need to make sure we have our seat at the table. Whether it's small or big, get your seat at the table, get there, stay there.
And with that, we're going to move to a dialogue amongst the panel. And at this point, I would ask our panelists to turn their cameras and microphones back on. And we are also going to ask you, the audience, to begin to ask your questions. You can either put them in the chat or in the Q&A section, and I will keep an eye on those. I want to start with just an open-ended question to each of the panelists. We heard both from that young woman, Shirlene Roberts, at the end, as well as Representative Gwen Moore, to get your seat at the table, get there, stay there. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. What does that statement mean to you personally? And anyone who wants to jump in, please go ahead.
Sure. I'll take it, Marissa.
Go ahead.
For me, I appreciate that. Like, you know, I think what it meant is that representation matters at every level, but there has to be participation of the democracy from not only with regards to participating in democracy and exercising that and effectuating that change, but also from representation for comprehensive policies that focus on those issues like equity and especially for women and childcare and pay equity, childcare, family leave, but also, you know, we all want a better life. We all want something that a policy is applicable to us. You know, the idea of politics is, you know, is effectuating that change, but this especially where it regards women and why it matters is because the future is female, you know, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity for all of us to participate in that democracy, but effectuate that change, because when women are at the table making those decisions are made with their thoughts, their ideas, and the understanding of who they represent.
Muted. Thank you, Shannon Holsey. Do any of our other panelists want to jump in on that one?
When women are at the table, they bring their life experiences. And much like Ruth Bader Ginsburg did, I'm going to use her example to turn the picture that comes perhaps to your mind. And it's a story about the importance of being at the table and bringing your life experience to the table's discussion, because the discussions are different. Things that we have as a life experience as women, not all men have. And this is the example of that Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave. And I know President Holsey gave some examples of advances made since the 1970s and 1980s. And some of those examples come from cases that were litigated by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the United States Supreme Court. And when she was litigating some of those cases, at that time, Rehnquist, then Justice Rehnquist, wasn't really on board with the movement. And in fact, he kind of proudly described himself as a male chauvinist. But his life experience changed. And his wife died in 1991 after suffering a long bout fighting cancer. And he was a primary caretaker for her. His daughter was divorced, and Rehnquist found himself going to pick up the kids from school, having to leave court conferences sometimes to pick up the kids. And so I think it was in 2003 when the Family and Medical Leave Act, the constitutionality of part of that, of sending it, how it applied in the states, came before the the United States Supreme Court. What did Rehnquist do? Number one, he wrote the opinion. And number two, he had that life experience of having to care for others, for family members, and for children. And so the importance of bringing your life experience to the table and having that experience add to the conversation is of utmost importance. I note Senator Baldwin also talked about that, but in different words, about the importance of being at the table to have your life experience develop the policy that is around the table. So those are my thoughts.
We have a question from the audience that relates to that. The question says, I was interested to hear Senator Baldwin talking about the work being done to make representation in Congress more equal to men, given to reflect actual demographics. I would be curious to hear our panelists talk about some of the key barriers to electing more women to higher office. Do we lack deep benches of candidates in our two major parties, or are the candidates there and as a society we still don't tend to elect women over men on average? What other barriers should we be thinking about?
Marissa, I think it's a number of things, but I think too, there is a imbalance because it has been primarily served by our male counterparts, but I don't think it's because we lack depth or capability. I think it's certainly too, a part of it is there's great organizations like Emily's List and other organizations that help prepare women for those roles. We need to, like Congresswoman Deb Haaland states, she's going to leave the ladder down because she's going to bring more women up, because I think that's really what it's about. It's about that exposure. It's about like what Justice Bradley talked about. It's the shared experience and the understanding of it, just like navigating anything else. Women are multitaskers. Women are capable of so many things. They're bringers of life. They bring that life experience. They raise children. They manage households. They're CEOs. They're CFOs. They transcend. And I don't think it's a matter of they lack the depth or the capabilities. I think what they bring is empathy. They bring a broader and diverse understanding, and they don't lack the bond of common humanity, because right now we are in a climate of a lot of divisiveness and fear and prejudices. And I think when you start to effectuate change, it requires diversity of thought. I always tell my tribal council, diversity of thought is welcome, but decorum and diplomacy is expected. And I think we've lost that. And I think we have to get back to that. I think that, we can't undermine government actions and disparities without coming together in a unified democracy. Our great Governor Evers said it's not right, left, it's forward. And it is absolutely forward.
Thank you, President Holsey. Justice Bradley, did you?
Sure. When Senator Baldwin indicated get more women in elected office as a goal, another way of stating having women at the table, women need to support other women. Women need to encourage other women. Surprisingly to some, maybe not to others, I've been trying to get women to run for judge in their various localities and around the state for years. And sometimes it's hard because women don't see themselves as running for an official position. They see men seldom think, well, I can't do it. Oftentimes the first response of a woman is, well, I can't do it under these circumstances. And I think the more women that run, the more you see women sitting around the table, the more you see women in elected positions. It reminds me of a story of my son, John, who was about, I don't know, let's say 5 or 6. Or maybe 4. And I was a circuit court judge in Marathon County. And I'd come home and he knew that I was a judge. And one time he looked at me and he said, Mom, can boys be judges too? And it's because, can boys be judges too? But it's what he saw. And to see what is possible is so important. That's why we have to get more women in elected positions. That's why, and if you don't want to run, you have to encourage others to run. There's no reason that we can't have a government that's reflective of the people they serve.
Absolutely.
Simone, you spoke to some very specific ways in which the suffragist movement moved forward. As we are looking at the history, do you see those elements as being necessary to advance women's rights as we are going forward and as we are seeing where there are still gaps in equity?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. I think that one of the things that my colleagues and I are constantly talking about is how is history relevant in our lives today? Why is it so important to look at the past, to understand how we got to where we are today, and then how we want to move forward, right? So you can do that in very specific ways where you can say, this is a strategy that worked in the past and it would likely work again. Or you can also use it as, the question about the seat at the table came up, to sort of cast that lens back and say, we've seen what the world looks like when women aren't at the table, right? And we know how we were represented. We understand, how that world worked because of where we came from. And we don't want to go back there. And so, use that lesson to sort of, to push things forward, to claim that seat at the table and say, we're not going to go back to how it was. We're going to keep moving forward. And in order for us to do that, we have to, keep using our vote, making sure that our voice is heard, getting closer to that 51% of representation in politics. It's funny because when you say that women should represent 51% of elected officials, people laugh at you, because it seems so ridiculous, but it shouldn't be. So we would never laugh if when men say that. So it's an interesting idea, but that idea that, where we come from and the stories are relevant to where we want to go is also important, which hits directly on what President Holsey was saying about representation. One of the things that vastly needs to be corrected is how we represent all groups, people of color, all groups in our history textbooks, and women are included in that demographic. If you look at history textbooks, you know, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but it's something like women's stories make up far less than 10% of the entire story that's told in a history textbook. So where's the 51% of representation there? And by increasing the representation, you also increase the idea in people's minds that they could do it too.
And if you add in the intersectionality of not only women, but women of color, I'm sure that representation goes down even further.
Oh, yes. Completely.
We have another question. What advice, and this can be to any one of you, what advice would you give to men who want to be good allies to women, especially those who are civically engaged? Justice Bradley?
Don't be shy. Listen, all of this happened. This is a united front. You know, it is not a matter of just enhancing women's rights, or that phrase that was used years ago, women's liberation. It's a movement to liberate men and women, right? It's both sides of the coin. And you look, whether it's the James family, as an example, Senator David James, or Ada James, or Laura Briggs James, or whether it's Lucy Stone and her husband that helped found the American Women's Association, Suffrage Association. I mean, together they found that organization. This is a joint effort. We need, as that advertisement with Uncle Sam, you know, we need you. We need men and we need women who are dedicated to the cause. And it's only with both men and women serving together. I was in Pakistan. I had the fortune, and it was a good fortune, of being in Pakistan a few years ago, and I was meeting with, as the introduction indicated, I'm the chair of the International Association of Women Judges Board of Managerial Trustees, and I was meeting with the Chief Justice of the Punjab, and he was the first one to sign up to be a member of the International Association of Women Judges, because he gets it. We need men and we need women coming together to advance the rights of both men and women.
Yeah. Simone?
Yeah, I would just add that remember that the suffragists had to convince the men of this country. That was who they had to convince, right? And so by joining together to convince them, that's when the movement was successful. It's so helpful, and the way that you can be supportive is just by being vocal and making sure that other men feel comfortable showing their support as well. So, you know, doing your part that way, I think is the best advice that I could give.
And I would, Marissa, say, you know, that platform of equality and inclusion, because dehumanizing people, regardless, debases us all. Humanity is beautifully and almost infinitively diverse. And the bonds of our common humanity must overcome the divisiveness of our fears and prejudices, because it could transcend, you know, in different perspectives. And people of power and privilege and moral conscience must stand up and decide what kind of nation we want to be, especially in this election. This is going to be one of the most critical elections of our lifetime. And we all have to say no more to the racially discriminatory actions that are happening. We have to create a platform or change that platform of inequality and the more economic disparities, you know, and then hold our elected officials accountable for those actions that really undermined our democracy. Because really, quite honestly, we are responsible for creating a world of peace and equality for ourselves and for our children. You know, men are birthed from women. If that isn't the ultimate respect, I don't know what is, quite honestly. We need a government as good as its people, because we're all better than this. And we the people means everyone. So that's the advice I would give.
We probably have time for just about one more question. We're going to try and be wrapped up by 8 so that people can see the debate happening after this. And I will kind of pair the fact that we have a debate, a vice presidential debate between a male and a female at 8 p.m. We have a question from Brad S. saying, in our political world, women are still judged differently than men. Women can't speak passionately without being called aggressive. We hear comments about the outfits of women candidates, but not of men. Women are judged based on emotional displays and clothing before ideas are considered. How do we change that perception and make ideas, not fashion, the main reason we choose women to represent us?
It's a struggle. Yeah, how do we do it? Persistence. Show up day after day. I'm going to end where we started. And that is this discussion, 1848 Seneca Falls. That kind of environment in the 1840s and 1850s, women were, various groups were excluded from the right to vote. There was, if you were a criminal, you couldn't vote. If you were an alien, if you were Black, if you were indigent, you couldn't vote. If you were an idiot, a lunatic, or a woman. And of course, the last 3, idiot, lunatic, and women, was because of the perceived inability to use sound judgment. We've come a long way since those regulations in 1840 and 1850. And the question asks and emphasizes, we have a long way to go. I think Senator Baldwin said it at the very beginning. We've made a lot of progress, but don't confuse, she said, progress for victory. We have a long way to go.
Anyone else?
I don't know if anyone could say it better than that. I mean, I just think it's doing the work, you know, we just got to keep doing the work. I think that some of those sort of vestiges of this, the clothing and how people look and things like that, unfortunately, that'll probably be some of the last of it to fall away. But if we keep doing the work, eventually I'm hopeful we'll get there.
Well, that seems like a great place to end. Hopefully we are thinking about the ideas if we are watching the vice presidential debate instead of looking at the clothing. I really want to thank all of our panelists. I wish we could continue this conversation for another hour or 2, but we really appreciate your time and your energy this evening. And we want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. For more, you can see on the WIP's website. You can also visit pbswisconsin.org. And we just want to thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your evening.